What Labour needs to do is get rid of this government. I think the defining moment was the death of John Smith. Labour now needs to set out a positive offer. I was a bit of a policy wonk as a teenager, as the way that many are. So I think that if you'd asked me what bit of politics I'd like to work in, it would have been in public policy, in think tanks. And I think that started very early. But I guess what made me political in the first place were those big public moments in the 90s. So, the failure of the Conservatives, the sort of seeing on the news as a kid, sort of the huge damage they were doing to the economy. And then, I think the defining moment was the death of John Smith, which was, for people becoming political at that moment was an incredibly emotional, defining moment where it felt like someone who was about to become Prime Minister had been ripped away. And of course, that led to New Labour and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and eventually a fantastic Labour government. So, Labour does not need to say we need to have that sort of high energy moment. What Labour needs to do is get rid of this government and prove it's a competent, honest, sort of a party that can govern with dignity. So it doesn't need to be fireworks. It needs to be getting the job done. Tony Blair and Keir Starmer are very different personalities, and we shouldn't just measure how the public emotionally reacts to Keir Starmer based on those former times with different personalities. They always say that leader of the opposition is the worst job in politics, but on top of that, he had to detoxify the Labour Party after the 2019 election, when so many people had felt that Labour had turned its back on them and their values and the sort of view of the country they had, and also some very difficult internal issues, particularly around the anti-Semitism crisis. So he's had to, if you like, do the decontamination of the Labour brand. He's also had to work through a pandemic and the extraordinary circumstances we've had, both sort of operationally, not being able to see each other, but also the goodwill people gave the government at the height of the pandemic for totally understandable reasons. So, the headwinds have all been against Keir Starmer, and yet he has basically done that exercise in wiping the slate clean on Labour. Now, he hasn't yet done enough to define Labour in terms of the positives that we on the left want people to associate with Labour, but he's got rid of the negatives, and that is no mean achievement. We are now moving to a sort of, if you like, the second phase of this Parliament. We're looking towards a general election probably in the next 2 years, and it's that moment where people sort of start to refocus on politics. It may not happen immediately, but Labour now needs to set out a positive offer that is setting out its values, and I think Keir Starmer's done a good job of that in recent months, but also starting to translate them into those memorable big picture ideas and policy commitments. The Labour Party does not need thousands of little policies. It's already got lots and people don't really notice them. It needs 2 or 3 really sort of eye-catching totemic things that sort of capture what it is about as a party. So sort of policy matters, but it matters to paint a picture at that top level, rather than to have an incredibly detailed plan of everything you want to do with the country. The Fabian Society has been running a research project looking at the marginal seats that Labour needs to win if it's going to form a government. There are 150 in total, 125 in England and Wales and 25 in Scotland. And if you take those in England and Wales, Labour's actually doing better in those seats at the moment than it is across the country in general, and particularly well in seats that it's not held for a long time. So the sorts of seats that are marginal seats but haven't been held since before 2010. And I think that shows that potentially the sort of the political map of Britain is ready to change, that you've got people who voted Labour, as the sorts of places that voted Labour in the 1990s and 2000s that haven't for quite a while now look as if they could turn again. Certainly that's what the polling is beginning to show us. What you see is what you get. There isn't, I don't think, a sort of a different Keir Starmer behind the scenes. He is a a very brainy professional lawyer and public servant with huge integrity and a serious demeanour who wants to get the job done. And I think that, you know, that comes across in his public performance. You know, he's got a character, a sort of set of qualities that, you know, do come across, you know, as a certain type of person who, you know, he is not Boris Johnson. He is not the sort of the everyman, you know, sort of joker and rogue that that Johnson is. You know, he is a serious-minded person. But, you know, people know that that's the deal. And if you think about who do you best want to run the country, particularly after the incompetence, chaos, corruption we've seen from the Conservatives, Keir Starmer is a very good candidate to have. In terms of sort of how do I feel about it, what I really feel this just demonstrates is the way that some people play politics as a game. And you've always seen that, I would argue, more from the right than the left, but particularly more from people like Boris Johnson. The journalists who turn into politics, or the PR people like Cameron who go into politics because they think they'd be good at it, they think they'd enjoy it, rather than that they've got a sense of calling and that they want to change the world. Labour is sometimes rather serious and, you know, doesn't always do its communication with people very well. But the people in the Labour Party, the MPs I talk to every day, I mean, they are a serious, honest bunch of people who want to change things and treat politics as not a game, as something, you know, there because they want to change people's lives. And there are lots of ways of criticising the Labour Party, but I think to say that, you know, they're not there with the highest of motivations and serious purpose, I mean, that's not the case. Labour needs to be serious about how it's going to increase living standards for people on low and middle incomes through the tax and benefit system. And this is really difficult because it costs money. Gordon Brown, as Chancellor and then Prime Minister, spent billions of pounds and it turned into results. It turned into lower pensioner poverty and lower child poverty. But the reality is you can only do that by growing the economy, raising taxes and spending the money. And Labour will need to be cautious about how much of that it promises from opposition, because we know that, you know, these days every manifesto gets costed up and people need to show where the pennies come from. So I think what you'll see is some small symbolic announcements to show that Labour is going to take living standards, the cost of living and eradicating poverty incredibly seriously. But I don't think you'll get a fully worked through costed plan before an election. I think it's really hard sitting here we are in the week of a crisis to sort of see through whether Boris Johnson will go or not. If you'd asked me this 3 days ago, I'd have said he'll get through, he'll be fine. Not fine, but wounded, and the Tories will sort of, you know, circle wagons, look after their man. I think it's now hard to see how that happens. I think because that special month of May 2020 was so deeply emotional for people's lives, for the loss of loved ones, I think it really becomes very hard for Johnson to just laugh this one off. So I think there will be a change of Prime Minister.